All right, so we're starting off the week with our learning objective after you've already done your attendance form and your contact tracing if you are in person. So it says students will be able to classify characteristics based on descriptions of archaea and bacteria domains and define taxonomy and recognize the importance of a standard taxonomic system. So obviously we have moved on from evolution and we're actually going into a new unit on taxonomy, and that's basically the system of organizing and identifying organisms that are alive. And you'll see soon why this is important, just because, organization is always nice, no matter what it is. So let's go on to the do now. So the do now is basically me asking you, here are a bunch of organisms. You can see a lion, you see a white pear flower, which is a tree. You see spear grass, which is a kind of dry grass you see in like dry savanna, almost desert areas. You see a crocodile, you see white ironwood, which is a kind of tree. You see the scarlet macaw, which is a kind of parrot. You see elephants and the yellow tree, which is named after its abundantly yellow flowers. So the question for the do now is, if you were going to organize these organisms, all these living organisms, into two main groups, how would you do that? Or what would be the groups? Right? So the most common way to group them would be to obviously do animals versus plants, right? And the main characteristic you would separate them by is who's able to move, right? Because we know that lions, crocodiles, scarlet macaws, and elephants are able to move on their own. And then plants like the white ironwood and speargrass technically don't move on their own, right? They experience movement through wind and water, but that's through a secondary path, right? It's not directly on their own. Another way is that the lion and all the other animals are heterotrophs and the plants are autotrophs. So you can group things by a lot of different characteristics. I just gave you two examples. And the way that scientists group things and organize us information for us to identify living things by is also along the same lines as what you just did. So we're going to go into what taxonomy is. So taxonomy is the classification of organisms in a hierarchical system based on shared characteristics or phylogenetic relationships. And we'll talk about phylogeny and phylogenetic relationships later on in an actual tree, but so you don't have to worry about that for now. But I do want you to notice that hierarchical is underlined because it's important to understand that when we're organizing things in taxonomy, we're following a kind of hierarchy. So a good example of a hierarchy that maybe you would understand is if you're in your history or government class and you talk about being low income, middle income, high income, or lower class, middle class, or high class based on how much maybe your family earns in a year. That's also a hierarchy, right? Back then in history, when we had in a serf system where we had not slaves, but after slaves where people were working for money, we had serfs, you had, the common class people, you had people who were nobility, and then you had the king and the emperors, right? That's also an example of a hierarchy. So a hierarchy means having levels, right? And the system of taxonomy that we use also has levels, as you can see on this right side, that's color-coded. So taxonomy is basically how scientists organize all of the organisms on Earth into one neat system. And we need this system because it keeps everything organized. It keeps everything organized for us to, locate organisms, for us to identify organisms, for us to name organisms, and for when you discover a new organism, where they are placed and how they're related to other organisms. The other reason why taxonomy is super important is because every scientist across the entire world uses the same taxonomic system. So it makes it easy for us to communicate with other scientists when you want to talk about a certain species of animal, or you want to talk about the discovery of a new animal, and everybody uses the same system. So that when I'm talking, for example, to a scientist that lives in Russia, we're going to be using the same system. So it's easy to communicate about it. Even though our languages are different, we still use the same scientific names and we still have the same characteristics for each organism. So that's why taxonomy is super useful. Organizing anything is useful, to be honest. So it all started with our man Linnaeus. So Carolus Linnaeus invented the field of taxonomy, and he invented the field of, or the system of, binomial nomenclature. And I'll get to that at the end of this kind of review. So he invented this field, and he is the founding father for our organization for how we identify all living things on Earth. And it's a system that we still use, which means he did a pretty dang good job because he did this a long time ago. So why do we classify organisms? Like I said, it sets up an organized system for scientists to name and categorize organisms. And it also helps show the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So you can see who's related to who and which organisms had the most recent common ancestor, right? If you look on the picture over here, the closest related organisms are the coyote and the wolf over here, but you can see that they're also related pretty recently through a common ancestor to otters and badgers right here, right? And then if you go back in history even more, there's a common ancestor somewhere back in the past to the cat family, and here we have a leopard, okay? So these little junctions right here, where you are going left or right, are kind of like the representations of where there used to be a common ancestor. And when you look at the branches, the ones that are closest to the right are the ones that are the most recent, and the ones that are closest to the left are the ones that were from a long time ago. So organisms can be put into the system and classified by using their DNA. So if you can extract DNA, you can see if the sequences match up a lot. You can look at their structure. We already talked about this when we did evidence for evolution, right? Analogies, homologies, vestigial structures, those all tell us how closely organisms are related, because if your structure is similar, you're probably pretty closely related and you probably have a recent common ancestor. And if you're pretty different, you probably have a more far back common ancestor in history. And then you can also observe behavior. So similar organisms or closely related organisms tend to have similar behaviors because they haven't speciated that much yet. So it hasn't been long since they speciated and became different species. So they still have pretty similar characteristics in how they behave, how they mate, how they find food. So behavior is another way that you can classify organisms. And the cool part is that there are about 5 to 10 million species estimated to exist in the world, right? Humans have not discovered everything yet. And that's pretty crazy because, first of all, there are older species we haven't ever discovered. And then there are new ones that are constantly evolving into brand new species that we are keeping up trying to capture all the time. So scientifically, we've only identified about 1.5 million of them. So that's less than 30% of the 5 to 10 million that could exist right now. And an example would be if we actually explore the deep, deep ocean, which humans don't really do because it's kind of scary down there. So if you observed the deep oceans, you'd probably find a lot of species that we haven't yet discovered, but it's hard to get there. It's not really safe yet, even with our current technology. So as for all we could know, there could be like a whole nother 50% of life down there that we don't even know exists. The classification system is also constantly changing because technological advances have allowed scientists to better analyze and understand organisms. Just to give an example, right? We all know what CAT scans are. We all know what CT scans are, especially if you do sports. And if you've ever broken a limb, you know what an X-ray is, right? A couple decades ago, X-rays didn't even exist. You couldn't see what bones looked like. So you had to guess, or you had to wait until organisms were dead for you to dissect them and see what their insides look like. So now that we have things like CT scans and X-rays, you can actually observe organisms while they're living. So it's a lot faster and a lot easier to identify new organisms and what their structures look like and how closely they are related to another organism. So the system has to change when our technology changes. Make sense? So here is our modern classification system. And we're going from kingdom. We actually have domain, which is above kingdom, but we'll go over that after. Today, we're just going to start with kingdom. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And it goes from the most broad up here at kingdom down to the most specific at species. So if you are talking about kingdoms, we are in the same kingdom as a lot of other organisms because there's only 4 kingdoms of all life. That includes plants, that includes mushrooms, that includes bacteria, right? There's only so many kingdoms of life. However, as you go down here, you get more and more specific. So for example, in a kingdom, you could have 7 million organisms that belong in one kingdom. But when you get all the way down to species, you only have maybe 1,000 organisms. So it gets a huge group, and it kind of encompasses a huge group of living organisms based on a very broad set of characteristics. And then when you get down to species, it becomes really specific, right? Species specific. So again, very general. The amount of organisms that fit in the kingdom are the most. That's why it's at the top of the pyramid. It has the biggest section of the pyramid. And as you go down, the species is the most specific. And there's only closely related organisms, right? Species can interbreed with each other. Animals in a kingdom can't necessarily interbreed with each other, right? You're not going to have birds interbreeding with humans, right? Because although they're in the same kingdom, they don't have to be close, like that closely related. They're just different from another kingdom. So here's another way to think about it, right? We have domains on the outside, and then we have kingdom, and it goes phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And as you get more and more specific, the group becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So when you go from kingdom all the way down to species, you see the amount of species, or sorry, amount of organisms that fit in each ring is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller. And for example, you can have a kingdom that has plants, right? All plants are in the same kingdom. And then you have a phylum within that plant, and they have a specific characteristics of producing flowers. So they are angiosperms, okay? And then within plants that produce flowers, you have plants that their seeds are dicots or have dicotyledons or have two halves. For example, like beans, right? You can split them in half, peanuts, right? Those are dicots. And then inside of dicotyledon plants, you have just specifically roses and closely related to roses organisms. Okay, and then within rosales, you have rosacea, which are specifically just roses. So you're getting more and more specific each time. And then within roses, you have the specific rose family and genus, right? So genus Rosa only refers to specific kinds of roses. So they're not cousins anymore. They're just this one family of roses. And then you're going to a genus, which is just one specific group within this family. Okay, and then there is a species, which is one type of organism, and it can only breed with the same type of organism, which is Rosa gallica. Okay, so you get more and more specific as you go down, right? If you notice, there's a lot of organisms that belong in plants, but there's only one that belongs in this specific species. Another example we can look at is the leopard, okay? So they're in the animal kingdom because they're an animal, right? Plants are in the plant kingdom. In the animal kingdom, not all animals have a cord or a chordate or a spinal cord, okay? So we know the leopard has a spinal cord, but can you think of an animal that does not have a spinal cord? Right? An example would be like a jellyfish, right? Jellyfish don't have spinal cords. So they would also be in Animalia, but they're not going to be in Chordata. Does that make a little sense? So it excludes some groups every single time you go into more specifics, okay? So within Chordata, you have Mammalia, which means mammals, which means that these organisms have fur or hair, and they produce milk out of mammary glands, okay? So what is an animal that has a spinal cord but is not a mammal? Think of an example. Right, the first one I think of is like a lizard or a fish, right? They have a spinal cord, but they don't produce milk for their babies, and they don't have fur or hair, okay? Within the mammals now, you have carnivora, because you know that leopards hunt and they eat meat, right? Do all mammals, do all warm-blooded animals eat meat? The answer is no, right? So what is an animal that you can think of that is a mammal, but only eats plants? I can think of a couple, right? Cows, horses, goats, right? Those are all mammals that do not belong in carnivora. So they would be in a separate order. Okay, so in the order Carnivora now, we have the family Felidae, which sounds like the word feline, which means cat, right? So we're getting into a carnivore family that is cat related. Okay, there are other carnivore families that are dog related, that are other animal related, right? But we're specifically in the family Felidae now. And then we have the genus Panthera, because they're panthers technically. And then the specific species that they are is Panthera pardus, which means that the only kind of panther that can interbreed with the leopard is the Panthera pardus because of the same species. So even within the Panthera genus, there are individual species. So again, we have a bunch of ways for you to remember the KPCOFGS for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And one example would be like, Katy Perry came over for green shoes. And this is a mnemonic device that helps you remember the letters and then helps you remember the words. Because if you make them into a sentence, it's more likely you're going to remember them instead of trying to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, because those are kind of random words that don't really make sense to you. Okay, so like I said, an example would be Katy Perry came over for green shoes because she's kind of got a weird fashion sense, right? So this is a sentence that makes it easier for me to remember. So I'm going to ask that you come up with your own now. So you're going to take the letters K, P, C, O, F, G, S, and you're going to think of a word for each of them that turns into a sentence. Okay, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and think You can plan them out by writing a bunch of them down, and then write down your final answer for me here. Okay, I'm going to play this taxonomy song for you before we go into binomial nomenclature. So we're going to go here, and then let me share this computer sound.
And the Mars traits that vary. Sign, shape, their habitat, and their type of babies. So we spend in the years wanting to organize the things. So we made a system we call a taxonomy. So every living thing is sorted in 7 major levels, seven, and at the top, starting by specific at the bottom. The domain, body strength, it starts with the kingdom, and phylum, class, order, and the genus and the species, the kingdom, and phylum, class, order, and the genus and the species. Now let's take a large taxon, the kingdom and Amelia, the phylum is Chordata, in class Mammalia, then order Carnivora, and family Canary. Canis is that genus and species that Volcanus lupus. Canis lupus. Okay, here we go. Scientists came to kingdoms. Plant animals, few bacteria, protists, fungi, archaea. And then the phylum divided into 30 phyla. More similar characteristics have in common. Then phyla broken down to classes, then ordered even smaller branches, then families next, more common. Genus very close to the end, specific on species, becoming Homo sapiens. Kingdoms and phylum, class, order, and the genus and the species, the kingdom, and phylum, class, order, and the genus and the species. Now let's take the large taxon, the kingdom and Amelia, the phylum is Chordata, in class Mammalia, then order Carnivora, and family Canary. Canis is that genus and species that Volcanus lupus. Lupus.
All right, so that was the taxonomy song. And as you can see, if you have a hard time remembering things and you aren't good at the mnemonic devices, you can always go ahead and make a song that helps you remember. So we're going to actually specifically talk about that last level that we kind of encountered a couple times, which is the species level. And the name of organisms in their scientific name is using binomial nomenclature. So Linnaeus also made the system called binomial nomenclature. And the reason why that's important is because you're not going to refer to an animal by their kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species every time you talk about them. So the easiest way to talk about organisms is to give them like a first and last name. And that is usually using their genus and their species. So it's like how you have a first name, last name, I have a first name, last name. These animals, all living species have their genus and species kind of as their first and last name. So the genus is obviously more broad, so it tells you kind of where they fall. And then their species is within their genus, what they are exactly. So the reason why it's called binomial nomenclature is because bi means two. Nomial literally means name. Nomen also means name, and clature means system. So binomial nomenclature actually means to name, naming system, which is, very creative, I guess, for science. So binomial nomenclature is a system used to identify all organisms using a two-part Latin name. So the reason why we call it organisms by their Latin name is because Latin is a language that is no longer evolving, right? It's a dead language. So you can use it because since it's no longer changing, we have a stable foundation to build this system off of. And like I said, we always use the genus first and then the species. And the genus is always capitalized and the species is lowercase. So the example I'm showing here is Homo sapiens, which in common English is just humans, right? Our genus is Homo and our species name is sapiens, right? There's other ones that are like Homo colossus, Homo erectus, right? Erectus based on the fact that they were the first ones to stand erect or stand up, okay? And then after that, all of the following species that came on, that developed based off these ancestors, eventually ended in us, which is Homo sapiens. So if we want to look at common names, we have ones like dogs here, which are Canis familiaris, right? So Canis familiaris Canis means canine, like dog, right? It comes from the same root word. And then familiaris is familiar, right? They're close to us. They are our pets. We domesticated them. Cat, felis, like feline. Domesticus, like domesticated. Wolf, Canis lupus, right? Again, Canis like dog, and then lupus is like lupine, which means wolf-like. It's an adjective. And then here we have foxes, which are Vulpes, Vulpes. If you know Pokemon, then you know that the little fox Pokemon before it evolves into the Ninetales is called Vulpix, right? That's actually based off of the scientific name, which I think is really cool that they use like real facts to base Pokemon off of. So here's an answer that I want from you. Dogs and wolves are in the same family, but not the same genus, right? Foxes and wolves are in the same class, but not the same order. Based on the scientific names down here, I want you to tell me, are wolves more closely related to dogs or to foxes? And how do you know? Right? So you want to look at the wolf name right here. Then you want to look at the dog name. And you want to look at the fox name. And you want to tell me which one is closer related to wolves? Is it dogs or is it foxes? And then I want you to tell me kind of why based on the scientific name. Okay. The answer is that wolves are more closely related to dogs because even though they have different species names, they have the same genus. Okay, but foxes have a different species name and a different genus. So they're recent common ancestors further back than wolves, right? But they're related because they're both in the same probably family or order, okay? So that's it for today's Edpuzzle. You are going to go ahead and do your interactive notebook section and then your exit ticket.